Sarah sat at the edge of her bed, staring at the soft glow of the clock on her nightstand. The familiar hum of the house filled the room, the groaning wood, the wind rattling the old windows. It was late, past midnight, and she had been up too long, her mind racing with thoughts she couldn't quiet. Bills piled up on the kitchen counter. Her job had been relentless. And then there was Dylan, her sweet, troubled boy, the one person who made it all worth it, but who also worried her the most. He had been acting out at school again, nothing serious, but enough to pull the strings of her already frayed nerves. The wind outside howled through the trees, a reminder of the storm forecasted for tomorrow. The isolation of the house, a choice she'd made to escape the suffocating grip of the city, often felt like a blessing. But nights like these, the isolation gnawed at her. She pulled the covers tighter around her shoulders, willing herself to sleep. Dylan had long since drifted off, his small body cocooned in his blankets. At least he was at peace. Then a sound pierced the silence. A knock, soft but distinct. Sarah froze, her heart quickening. She strained to hear, the house eerily quiet. Knock, knock, knock. Her breath caught in her throat. Who would be at her door this late? Her mind raced through possibilities, an emergency, a neighbor. But the nearest house was a mile down the road. A random stranger, lost in the dark. She slowly slipped out of bed, her bare feet silent against the wooden floor. The house was still, so still that the only sound was her own pulse pounding in her ears. She grabbed her robe and wrapped it around herself, a small shield against the sudden cold that seemed to creep through the air. Another knock, louder this time, insistent. Sarah crept down the hallway, careful not to make a sound. Her breath was shallow, her hands trembling as she approached the front door. She paused, one hand on the doorknob, the other pressed against her chest, trying to calm her racing heart. "Who is it?" Her voice came out shakier than she'd intended. Silence. She reached for the light switch, illuminating the front porch. What she saw made her blood run cold. Two children stood side by side on the porch, a boy and a girl, both with pale, waxen skin. Their faces were expressionless, lips slightly parted as if waiting for something. They couldn't have been more than 10 years old, though something about them felt off, as though they didn't quite belong to the world outside her door. Their clothes were simple, unremarkable, worn jeans, plain shirts, but their skin had an unnatural pallor, the kind of cold, bloodless look that only the dead might wear. Sarah blinked, her grip tightening on the doorknob. This had to be some kind of mistake. Maybe they were lost. Before she could speak again, the boy looked up. His eyes were wrong. Completely black, no whites, no pupils. Just deep, inky voids where his eyes should have been. The girl followed suit, raising her head to reveal the same abyssal gaze. "Can we come in?" the boy asked, his voice flat, almost mechanical. Sarah's throat tightened. Something inside her recoiled in fear, a primal instinct telling her to turn around, to run. But her body was frozen, her mind racing with questions that had no answers. The girl's voice joined his, as cold and monotone as his. "We're lost, and we need to come in." Every alarm bell in Sarah's mind went off at once. She had heard stories, urban legends, the kind of things passed around in hushed voices, but she had never believed them. Still, here they were, these children, staring at her with eyes that weren't human. I can't help you," she stammered, barely able to form the words. "You need to go." "Please, we need to come in," the boy repeated, his voice no longer a request, but something heavier, something darker. Sarah's pulse raced, her skin crawling with the sensation that something terrible was about to happen. The wind howled louder outside, as if the world itself was warning her. She gripped the doorframe, feeling the weight of the children's gaze pressing down on her. Her hands shook as she forced herself to move, to shut the door. But they didn't stop staring. They didn't move. They just stood there, watching her with those impossibly black eyes, like shadows waiting to seep into her home. "Please," the girl whispered again, softer this time. "We're so cold." Sarah's hand finally found the strength to close the door. She slammed it shut, the sound echoing through the hallway like a gunshot. Her heart hammered in her chest, her body trembling as she quickly turned the lock. Silence. She stood there for what felt like hours, her back pressed against the door, listening for any sign of movement on the other side. But there was nothing. No footsteps, no voices, just the quiet hum of the house settling around her. Slowly, she peeked through the peephole, expecting to see them still standing there, their eyes fixed on her, waiting for her to change her mind. But the porch was empty. The children were gone. Sarah's breath came in short, ragged bursts as she stumbled away from the door, her legs weak beneath her. She rushed to the window, pulling the curtain back just enough to look outside. Nothing. No sign of the children. No footprints in the snow, just the dark, empty street, as if they had never been there at all. Her hands were still shaking when she climbed back into bed, but sleep wouldn't come. All she could think about was the cold, black eyes of the children, and the quiet, chilling way they had asked to be let in. What would have happened if she had opened the door? The days after the knock passed in a haze, but Sarah couldn't shake the feeling of unease that had rooted itself deep in her chest. She told herself that it was over, that she'd imagined the strange encounter with those children. She had to. Life didn't allow room for such thoughts, not with Dylan needing her, her quiet, sensitive boy. He hadn't mentioned anything strange, hadn't said anything about children at the door. For a while, it seemed like it had all been a dream, a vivid nightmare brought on by the stress of single motherhood and sleepless nights. But then, she saw them again. It was just a glimpse at first. She was standing in the kitchen, cleaning up after dinner, when something caught her eye through the window. She looked up, and there they were, standing across the street just beyond the edge of the yard. The same two children, pale, motionless, watching her with those empty black eyes. Sarah's blood ran cold. The plate slipped from her hands, shattering on the floor. She rushed to the window, yanking the curtains closed, her heart pounding in her chest. She couldn't breathe, couldn't think. The air around her felt thick and suffocating. "They can't be real," she whispered to herself, clutching the counter for support. "They can't be real." She peeked through the curtains once more, just to be sure. They were gone. The next few days were a blur of anxiety and sleepless nights. She couldn't shake the feeling that she was being watched, even inside the house. Every window felt like an open invitation for those children to peer through, their soulless eyes following her every move. She started avoiding them, keeping the curtains drawn at all times, the house dim and shuttered like a tomb. But it didn't help. They were always there, in the reflection of the glass when she passed a window, standing at the edge of her vision in dark corners, shadows that shouldn't have been there. And then there were the sounds, the soft tapping at the windows late at night, the creak of floorboards when she was certain no one else was awake. The worst part was that Dylan didn't seem to notice any of it. He played as he always did, his laughter echoing through the house, blissfully unaware of the creeping dread that consumed her. Sarah didn't know how much longer she could keep pretending that everything was normal. Then one night, everything changed. It was late, well after midnight, when Sarah woke with a start. The room was still, the house eerily silent. She had grown accustomed to the quiet, but this felt different, like the air was pressing down on her, thick and suffocating. And then she heard it, the soft, rhythmic creaking of floorboards down the hall. It was so faint she almost convinced herself it was nothing, a trick of the old house. But it continued, slow and deliberate, getting closer. Her heart began to race. She threw the covers off and crept toward the door, holding her breath as she opened it just a crack. The hallway was dark, the shadows long and unnatural, as though they had a life of their own. She strained her ears, listening. Creak, creak. The sound was coming from Dylan's room. A cold wave of terror washed over her. She rushed down the hall, her feet silent on the floor. She had to reach him, had to protect him. She pushed open his door, her breath catching in her throat. There, standing at the foot of his bed, were the children. The same boy and girl, their skin pale and bloodless, their black eyes gleaming in the faint light from the hallway. They didn't move, didn't speak. They just stood there, watching Dylan as he slept, their heads tilted ever so slightly, as if they were waiting for something. Sarah's blood turned to ice. For a moment, she couldn't move, couldn't breathe. Her feet were rooted to the floor, her body frozen in place by some invisible force. "Get away from him," she finally whispered, her voice barely audible, shaking with fear. But the children didn't react. They just stood there, still and silent, their eyes never leaving Dylan. She wanted to scream, to rush forward and tear them away from her son, but her body refused to obey. Instead, the children slowly turned their heads toward her, their eyes locking onto hers. The blackness of their gaze was endless, a void that seemed to pull her in, to drain the strength from her body. The girl took a step forward. Sarah's heart raced, her limbs trembling as the girl inched closer, her small, pale hand reaching out as if to touch her. "No!" Sarah gasped, stumbling backward, finally breaking free of whatever invisible force held her. She turned and bolted from the room, her mind reeling, fear overtaking every rational thought. She could barely feel her legs beneath her as she rushed down the hall, blindly groping for her phone. When she reached the kitchen, she stopped, her breath coming in ragged gasps. She braced herself against the counter, her hands shaking so violently she could barely dial the number. She didn't even know who she was calling. Police? An ambulance? Did it even matter? But before she could press the call button, the sound of footsteps behind her made her freeze. Slowly, she turned. Dylan stood in the doorway, his eyes half closed, his face bathed in the dim light from the hallway. He rubbed his eyes sleepily, his voice a soft mumble. "Mom? Why are you yelling?" Sarah's heart twisted painfully in her chest. She rushed to him, pulling him into her arms, holding him tightly, as if he might slip away from her at any moment. "Oh, sweetie, I'm sorry. I didn't mean to wake you." He yawned, blinking up at her with sleepy confusion. "What's wrong?" Sarah hesitated. How could she explain this? How could she tell him that something was haunting their home? Haunting her? That she had seen those children in his room? He was just a little boy. He wouldn't understand. "Nothing," she whispered, forcing a smile as she brushed the hair from his face. "It's nothing. Let's get you back to bed." She walked him back to his room, her eyes scanning every shadow, every corner, half expecting to see them again, waiting for her. But the room was empty. The air felt heavy, but there was no sign of the children. She tucked Dylan into bed, her hands still trembling, her heart heavy with dread. As she leaned down to kiss his forehead, she couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong. And she was right. That night was only the beginning. The cold settled into Sarah's bones, and she could not shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong. Each night she double-checked the locks, closed the curtains, and moved through her house as if it were an unfamiliar place, an intruder's lair rather than her home. The black-eyed children were always at the edge of her mind, a creeping sense of dread that never left her. But what truly unsettled her now was the change in Dylan. It had started gradually, almost imperceptibly. At first, Sarah chalked it up to the nightmares, the ones she assumed he was having, though he never told her about them. She had heard him tossing and turning at night, mumbling under his breath in his sleep. The next morning, she would ask if he had bad dreams, and Dylan would just shake his head, offering nothing more than a sleepy smile. But that wasn't all. Dylan's usual bright, curious nature seemed dimmed somehow, like a candle flickering on its last bit of wick. He was quieter, more withdrawn. Sarah noticed him staring off into space for long stretches of time, his face blank, as though he were somewhere else entirely. Whenever she called his name during these moments, he would blink and look at her, his eyes distant before they focused on her, as though dragging himself out of a deep, unsettling trance. One afternoon, as she picked Dylan up from school, she couldn't help but ask, "Are you feeling okay, sweetheart? You've been awfully quiet lately." He looked up at her from the back seat, his expression unreadable. "I'm fine, Mom." There was something about his tone that sent a shiver down her spine. Too flat, too empty. She forced a smile, trying to push away the growing anxiety gnawing at her insides. "You know you can talk to me, right? About anything." "I know." His voice was calm, but there was no warmth in it. They drove the rest of the way home in silence. That night, Sarah sat in her bedroom, her laptop open on her lap, the blue glow of the screen casting eerie shadows across the room. She was supposed to be working, but her mind wandered. Every creak of the floorboards, every gust of wind rattling the windows, made her flinch. She had begun researching, looking for answers, urban legends, folklore, anything that could explain what had happened. But there was so little to go on, and what she did find only made her more paranoid. Her thoughts were interrupted by the sound of Dylan's voice, soft and distant, coming from down the hall. She paused, her heart skipping a beat. Was he talking to someone? Sarah stood slowly, moving toward the hallway, her pulse quickening with each step. The closer she got to Dylan's room, the clearer his voice became. He was whispering, but she couldn't make out the words. She pushed the door open just a crack, peering inside. Dylan sat on his bed, his back to the door, his small frame illuminated by the glow of his bedside lamp. But what made Sarah's stomach churn was the fact that he wasn't alone. At the foot of the bed stood the two black-eyed children. Sarah's breath caught in her throat. They stood there, still as statues, their lifeless eyes fixed on Dylan. The girl was closest to him, her pale hand hovering just inches from his shoulder, while the boy stood beside her, his head tilted at a sharp, unnatural angle. "Dylan," Sarah whispered, stepping into the room, her voice shaking with terror. Dylan turned slowly, his face blank, his eyes glazed over. He didn't seem startled by her sudden presence. "They're my friends, Mom," he said, his voice soft but disturbingly calm. "They just want to talk." Sarah's heart hammered in her chest. "No, Dylan. They're not your friends. You need to stay away from them." The girl's hand drifted closer, almost brushing Dylan's shoulder. Sarah's pulse quickened, and she lunged forward, grabbing her son and pulling him away from the edge of the bed. But the moment her fingers touched his arm, he let out a sharp cry, jerking away from her as though she had burned him. "Don't!" he shouted, his voice full of an emotion she hadn't heard in weeks. Anger. Sarah stumbled back, her heart breaking as she saw the wild, fearful look in his eyes. "Dylan, I'm trying to protect you." "They're not bad," he said, his voice trembling with conviction. "They told me. They're not going to hurt me." Her skin crawled at the way he spoke, so sure, so certain, like he had been convinced of something she couldn't see. She glanced at the children, still standing at the foot of the bed, their faces devoid of any expression, watching the scene unfold with eerie detachment. "They're lying to you, Dylan," Sarah pleaded, trying to stay calm despite the terror clawing at her insides. "They're not what they seem. You have to trust me." Dylan's eyes flickered, the anger giving way to something far worse, confusion as though he didn't know who to believe. For a moment he hesitated, his small fists clenched at his sides. "They've been here every night," he whispered. "They say they're my friends. They say they can make everything better." Sarah's breath hitched. "Dylan, please, you have to listen to me. You can't let them in. You can't talk to them." His face twisted in frustration, and for a split second, Sarah saw something dark flicker in his eyes, something she had never seen in her son before. It was almost as though the blackness that filled the eyes of the children was spreading, creeping into her son's very soul. "I want to go with them," he muttered, his voice distant, detached. Sarah's heart sank, a cold pit of dread forming in her stomach. This wasn't her Dylan, not anymore. "No," she said firmly, stepping forward again. "You're not going with them. You're staying here with me. You're my son." For a moment, the tension in the room hung heavy, the air thick with the suffocating dread. Dylan stared at her, his expression torn between the boy he once was and the stranger that seemed to be emerging in his place. The children took a step forward, their movements so slow and deliberate that it made Sarah's skin crawl. "He belongs with us," the boy whispered, his voice carrying a weight that sent chills down Sarah's spine. "No," Sarah shouted, grabbing Dylan and pulling him toward her. "He's my son. You can't have him." The children didn't move, but their presence was overwhelming, as though the very room had grown colder, darker. Sarah's grip tightened on Dylan, and he struggled in her arms, his small body thrashing as if trying to escape her grasp. "Dylan, please," Sarah begged, her voice cracking. "Don't let them take you." Tears filled her eyes as she held on to him, her heart breaking with every second that passed. She could feel him slipping away from her, not physically, but emotionally, mentally. Something inside him was changing, and she didn't know how to stop it. And then, as if something broke within him, Dylan went limp in her arms. His head rested against her chest, and for a moment he was her little boy again. But when he looked up at her, his eyes were no longer his own. They were black, just like theirs. The children stood motionless, their empty eyes fixed on Sarah, watching her hold her son, waiting. The boy spoke again, his voice soft and patient. "He's ours now." Sarah clutched Dylan to her chest, sobbing as she whispered over and over, "No, you can't have him." But even as she held him, she knew deep down that the battle wasn't just outside her door anymore. It was inside her home, inside her son. The house was quiet, too quiet. Sarah sat in the darkened living room, the clock on the wall ticking away the seconds, each one louder than the last. Every breath felt labored, as though the very air in the house had thickened, pressing down on her chest. It was late, later than she dared to check. But she didn't need to know the time. She knew what was coming. She had been waiting for it. Dylan was asleep upstairs. Or at least that's what she told herself. Lately, there was no way to know for sure. He hadn't been the same for weeks, his once bright eyes now dulled by something that wasn't him, something she couldn't reach, couldn't pull him back from. She couldn't lose him, not to them. Outside, the wind picked up, howling through the trees like a warning. The sound rattled the windows, but it wasn't the wind that chilled Sarah to her core. It was the feeling, the unmistakable sensation that had grown stronger every night. The weight of unseen eyes watching, waiting, biding their time. Her hand clutched the phone, the other gripped the baseball bat she had taken to carrying around the house, useless though it felt. She had tried to call for help before, but every time something stopped her. A voice in her head, a creeping doubt. What would she even say? Who could help her? What would they believe? She wasn't dealing with anything human. A sound came from the hallway. Sarah's heart leapt into her throat, and her grip on the bat tightened. She turned her head slowly, every nerve in her body screaming at her to run, but she couldn't. Not when she knew what or who was at stake. Dylan. The noise came again, footsteps, soft but unmistakable, growing closer. She rose to her feet, her pulse pounding in her ears as she moved toward the hallway. Her legs felt heavy, her breath shallow as she reached the bottom of the stairs. "Mom?" The word came from the darkness above, a small voice, but not quite right. Dylan stood at the top of the stairs, his face partially hidden in shadow, his small form eerily still. Something about the way he stood, the way he looked down at her, made Sarah's stomach twist. It wasn't the way her son had ever looked at her. "Dylan," Sarah's voice trembled, barely above a whisper. "Come down here, sweetie." But he didn't move. He just stared down at her, his eyes reflecting the faint light from the living room. And in that moment, she saw it again. The blackness, the same endless void that had haunted her for weeks. The children were still with him, inside him. "I don't want to stay here," he said, his voice distant, disconnected. "I want to go with them." Sarah's blood ran cold. The fight she had been dreading was here, and she wasn't ready. "No, Dylan." She shook her head, stepping closer to the bottom of the stairs. "They can't have you. You're my son, and you're staying with me." "They said they can make me better," he whispered, his small hand gripping the banister. "They said I belong with them now." Tears welled in Sarah's eyes. She took another step forward, trying to keep her voice steady. "Dylan, they're lying to you. You don't belong to them. You belong to me. I'm your mother, and I'm going to protect you." His gaze wavered for a moment, as though something inside him was struggling to break free, but it was fleeting. The shadows behind him seemed to pulse, and in the dim light, Sarah saw movement. The children, the black-eyed children, emerged from the darkness, their pale faces expressionless, their hollow eyes fixed on her. The girl spoke first, her voice as soft and cold as ever. "He's one of us now." "No," Sarah's voice broke, her throat tight with fear and desperation. "He's not. You can't have him." The boy took a step forward, his eyes blacker than the night itself. "You have to let him go. He's chosen." Chosen. The word echoed in Sarah's mind, a word that didn't belong to a child, but to something ancient, something unspeakably dark. "He's my son," Sarah screamed, rushing up the stairs, her bat raised, heart pounding in her chest. But the children didn't flinch. They didn't even move. They simply stood there, waiting. When Sarah reached Dylan, she dropped the bat, her hands trembling as she reached for him. "Dylan, please don't go with them," she whispered, tears streaming down her face. "Please." For a moment, Dylan's eyes softened, his small hand reaching up to touch her cheek. "Mom," he whispered, his voice almost tender. "I'm tired." "I know, sweetheart. I know," Sarah choked out, holding him tightly. "But I'm here. I won't let them take you." The children watched, their expressions unchanged, their presence suffocating. Sarah could feel them pressing in on her, the coldness wrapping around her like a vice. They weren't going to leave without him. She could feel it. "You can't stop us," the boy whispered, his voice echoing in the small hallway. "We're already inside." Sarah's breath hitched. She pulled Dylan closer, holding him as if sheer force of will could protect him from whatever was trying to take him away. "I won't let you have him," she growled, her voice fierce through the tears. "I'll fight you. I'll do whatever it takes. You hear me? You won't take my son." The girl took another step forward, her empty eyes narrowing. "You don't get to choose." Suddenly, the air around them shifted. The lights flickered, and a deep, unnatural cold filled the hallway. Sarah's heart raced as the shadows around the children seemed to grow, stretching toward her like dark tendrils. They were coming for Dylan. They were going to take him. "No!" Sarah screamed, pulling him away, shielding him with her body. "Get out! Leave us alone!" The children didn't move. They simply stood, waiting, watching. And then, in a voice that made Sarah's blood freeze, the boy said, "It's time." Dylan looked up at her, his blackened eyes filled with a strange kind of sadness. "Mom," he whispered, his voice soft. "It's okay." "No, it's not," Sarah sobbed, clutching him tightly. "You stay with me. You stay with me." The cold grew sharper, the darkness pressing in. Sarah closed her eyes, rocking him in her arms, her tears soaking into his hair. She whispered his name over and over, willing him to stay, begging for something, anything, to save him. But when she opened her eyes, the children were gone. The house was silent again, the air warm and still. Sarah looked down at Dylan, her heart pounding in her chest. His eyes were closed, his face peaceful, but she couldn't shake the feeling of dread that gnawed at her. "Dylan?" she whispered, gently shaking him. "Dylan, wake up." But he didn't stir. "Dylan?" Her voice cracked, panic rising as she shook him harder. "Please, Dylan, wake up." His eyes fluttered open, and for a brief moment, Sarah felt a surge of hope. But then he looked up at her and her heart stopped. His eyes, those deep, inky black eyes, stared back at her. She pulled him close, her body shaking with sobs as she held him tightly, unwilling to let go, unwilling to accept the truth that had settled into her bones. The fight was over, and she had lost.